He said it for the first time, not with defiance and not with pride, but with despair, when he realized that words no longer protected him, and that reality did not care who he believed himself to be, because war does not ask for consent. It simply presents a fact from which people either run or break or learn to do what only yesterday seemed unthinkable. "I'm not a soldier," he repeated, looking at the man in front of him. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from fear that no longer had anywhere to go. "I've never held a weapon. I don't know how to shoot. I don't know how to look at a person and decide that they should no longer live." The man standing before him did not look cruel, and that was the worst part, because his voice was calm, tired, the kind of voice used by people who had long stopped arguing with war. "That's exactly why you're still alive," he replied slowly, looking him straight in the eyes. "Soldiers die first, because they know the rules. You don't know them, and that's why you still think you have a choice." He wanted to argue, to say that there is always a choice, that he was a civilian, that he had signed no papers, sworn no oaths. But behind him another explosion thundered, and the ground shook as if reality itself were laughing at those arguments. "I just want to survive," he said hoarsely, and there was more shame than fear in those words. "I don't want to become someone I'm not. I don't want this to define me forever." The man beside him was silent for a long time, and in that pause there was more truth than in any speech. Then he extended the weapon to him, not abruptly, not aggressively, but as if handing over a burden he could no longer carry himself. "War doesn't turn people into soldiers," he finally said. "It turns them into those who survive, and those who don't. And if you don't learn to shoot today, tomorrow you'll have to learn how to die faster than you can understand why." He looked at the metal in his hands and felt something breaking inside. Not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly and painfully, because it was not fear of death, but a farewell to the illusion that one could pass through war without touching its filth. "If I do this," he whispered without lifting his eyes, "I'll never be able to say that I'm just a civilian." The man beside him answered without pity, but without cruelty either, as if stating a truth everyone here already knew. "You won't be able to say many things anymore," he said, "but if you survive, you'll have a chance one day to tell the truth. And the dead, no matter how correctly they lived, say nothing at all." The explosion came closer than before, and he gripped the weapon instinctively, not yet knowing how to shoot, but already understanding that the first step had been taken, and that this act was only the beginning of a story in which a civilian does not become a soldier by choice, but learns to kill so that war does not make the final decision for him. The first lesson had nothing to do with technique, because he was not being taught how to shoot, but how to stop trembling. And that was humiliating, because he suddenly understood that fear does not disappear when someone says, "Hold yourself together." It simply finds a new place in the body. Now it lived in his fingers, which refused to obey when he tried to line up the sights. "Don't look at the person," the same man said, standing too close for him to escape the voice. "Look at the movement, the silhouette, the threat. Because the moment you start seeing a face, you will be 1 second late. And here, that second is never forgiven." He nodded, even though everything inside was screaming, because every word sounded like a betrayal of himself. When he raised the weapon, the world narrowed to a shaking line in front of his eyes. Behind it was not a target, but the idea of a person he would have called someone just like me yesterday. "I can't," he said suddenly. His voice broke, and there was more anger in it than fear. "I can't just erase someone and call it necessity, because then I no longer know where I end and where this damn war begins." The man beside him did not get angry, and that was more frightening than shouting. He looked at him as if he had heard this 1,000 times already. "You think we started differently?" he answered heavily. "The only difference is that you still have words. We ran out of them a long time ago. Everyone who stood here before you also said, 'I can't.' Not all of them had time to say it a second time." A shot rang out suddenly, not his, somewhere nearby. He flinched so hard that he dropped to his knees, feeling shame stronger than fear. Because the war was not going to wait for him to sort himself out. And that realization was brutal and final. "Get up," the man said sharply, but not cruelly. "There is no time for clean hands here. There is only time for a choice, made either by you or for you." He stood up slowly, as if every movement resisted the very fact of reality, and took the weapon again. Not as an object anymore, but as a line beyond which life before ended. "If I do this," he said through clenched teeth, "I want to know that it won't make me empty, that something will remain in me besides reflex." The man held his gaze longer than before, and answered quietly but in a way that cut deeper than a shout. "The empty ones are those who shoot without questions," he said. "You are still asking. That is what hurts. That is what slowly kills you inside. But as long as it hurts, you are still human, even if you learn how to kill." He raised the weapon again. This time his hands trembled less, but his heart was pounding as if it wanted to tear free. Because the second act of this story was not about skills and not about shots. It was about the moment when a civilian begins to understand that learning to kill is not the loss of fear, but a daily agreement with one's own conscience. An agreement no one guarantees you will ever be able to break. The first time did not come as a moment of heroism. It came as a failure, where the body acted before the thought, and that was the most terrifying part, because he understood that the line was crossed not when he pulled the trigger, but when he did not manage to object to himself in time. "You fired," the same man beside him said, and it was not a question but a statement, cold and precise. "Do not think about why and for what right now, because if you start digging, you will break faster than the enemy reloads." He stood there, feeling neither his legs nor his hands, staring at the place where a second ago there had been movement, and now there was emptiness that screamed louder than any sound. From that emptiness burst not sobbing, but rage, aimed not outward, but inward. "I didn't want this," he said hoarsely, gripping the weapon as if it were guilty. "I didn't want to become the one who decides who lives and who doesn't. I didn't ask for this right, and I don't want to carry it with me for the rest of my life." The man beside him did not look away and answered slowly, with a heavy, brutal honesty that left no room for illusions. "None of us wanted to," he said. "But war does not ask about desire. It assigns roles, and if you refuse to play, it simply removes you from the stage without explaining why." He felt despair rise to his throat, not from fear of punishment and not from remorse, but from the realization that there was no way back, because even if he never fired again, this moment was already written into him forever. "Tell me," he almost whispered, "how do you live with this? How do you look at yourself afterward when you understand that the civilian in you is gone?" The man fell silent for a long time, and that pause was more frightening than any answer because it showed that there was no easy path. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, broken by experience. "I don't live with it," he said. "I live despite it. And if you don't want to lose your mind, remember one thing. Don't let it become a habit. Habit kills faster than bullets. And if every shot hurts, it means there is still something alive in you." Somewhere very close came the order to move on, sharp and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. In that ordinariness he felt real horror, because the world did not stop, did not freeze, did not acknowledge the tragedy. It simply moved on. "Get up," the man beside him said more quietly. "Now you know that it's possible, and it's with this knowledge that you will have to live. Because the third act begins not when you learn how to shoot, but when you realize that you can do it again." He stood up slowly, feeling two forces fighting inside him, the desire to fall and the desire to survive at any cost. And in that moment he understood that the greatest fear was still ahead, because now the war would not wait for his first shot, but for the moment when he would stop asking himself who he was becoming with each next one. After that, he stopped waiting for orders with the same fear, because the fear changed its shape. It no longer screamed. It stayed silent inside, tightening his chest every time his hands reached for the weapon on their own. And that automatic movement frightened him more than the first shot, because it meant the war had begun embedding itself into his body. "You react faster now," said the same man, watching how he moved. There was no praise in his words, only a statement of fact. "That's good for us and bad for you, because the less you think, the easier it is to survive, but the harder it becomes to remember who you were." He wanted to argue, to say that he still remembered, that every shot still hurt, but the words stuck. The truth was worse. The pain was dulling, not disappearing, becoming background noise, the kind you get used to. And that was the beginning of the most dangerous stage. "I catch myself thinking," he said once, staring into the darkness beyond the positions, "that sometimes I hope for movement, for a threat, because then everything becomes simpler. Then I don't have to think about whether I'm living correctly. I just have to act." The man beside him slowly turned his head, and something like regret appeared in his eyes. "That's how civilians disappear for good," he answered heavily. "Not when they fire their first shot, but when they begin waiting for the next one. Because expecting violence as relief is a point you rarely come back from." The days blended together, and he noticed that he had learned to joke between shellings. Laughter returned, but it was dry, sharp, without joy. That laughter was more frightening than silence because it meant adaptation, acceptance, the war being woven into everyday life. "You still think you're not a soldier," one of the newer ones said, looking at him with strange respect, "but you already act like one of us." The words hit painfully because there was no insult in them, only fact. And he felt anger, not at the one who said it, but at himself, at the part of him that had begun to agree. "I don't want this to become me," he said later, almost in despair, speaking to the man who had trained him from the beginning. "I'm afraid I'll wake up one day and realize I don't care who's in front of me as long as I survive." The man stayed silent for a long time, then answered quietly, as if the words were carved from his own experience. "If that fear is still with you," he said, "then you haven't lost yourself completely. But remember this: war doesn't take your humanity by force. It waits until you agree to put it off for later. And that later almost never comes." He remained sitting in the darkness, listening to distant explosions that no longer made him flinch, and understood that the fourth act of this story was not about combat or training, but about a daily fight against his own simplification, against the desire to stop feeling. Because the most terrifying realization was still ahead. Learning to kill can be quick, but remaining a civilian inside is almost impossible without conscious resistance every single day. He understood he had reached the limit when he caught himself thinking that he could do it again, and not break immediately, and that frightened him more than anything else, because the fear of killing had not disappeared completely, but had become manageable, convenient, something you could live with, and therefore something that could stay forever. "You will survive," the same man said quietly, almost as if saying goodbye. "But that is no longer the question. The question is who you will come out of this as, if you come out at all." He looked at his hands, calm, steady, too obedient, and felt anger not toward the war and not toward the enemy but toward himself, because the worst part was not that he had learned to shoot, but that a part of him had learned to justify it without screaming inside. "I am still not a soldier," he said stubbornly, angrily, as if clinging to the last fragment of himself. "I will not let this war decide that this is all I can be." The man beside him looked for a long time, heavily, and in his gaze there was neither faith nor skepticism, only the truth of someone who had already walked this path. "You may not be a soldier," he replied, "but you will never again be the civilian you were. And if you want to survive not only in body, you will have to remember every moment when you did not want to shoot, and never allow yourself to forget why that mattered." The next time the threat appeared again, he raised his weapon, but this time he felt no relief, and in that absence of relief there was something right, because he understood that he was still capable of stopping himself inside, even if his body was ready to act. "If I survive," he whispered into the darkness, "I will not let this become the language I speak for the rest of my life." He did what he had to do, and the pain did not disappear, but it did not break him completely either, because now he knew. Humanity is not the refusal to act, but the memory of the cost of every action, even when there is no choice. When the night ended, he sat in silence, not celebrating and not justifying himself, and for the first time in a long while he felt not calm, but responsibility, heavy, uncomfortable, but alive, because it was exactly this that separated a human being from a mechanism. And that was the real ending. Not that a civilian learned to kill, but that he decided not to let the war explain to him who he had become, because even amid violence there remained one right it could not take away: the right to remember that he was not a soldier, even if he was forced to do a soldier's work.